The voice was deep and guttural, laced with an ancient weight that made Ella's skin crawl. Her name echoed through the cold air of the basement, carried on a phantom wind that set the dust swirling in hypnotic patterns. She sat frozen on the damp floor, her mind caught in a silent scream, as the darkness inside the chest seemed to reach out, clawing at the edges of the room. Who are you?" Ella finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The air shifted. The voice answered, but not with words. Instead, Ella's mind was filled with a sudden rush of images: flames devouring the house, a woman's anguished cry, and a man standing at the center of it all, his smile cruel, his eyes gleaming like twin voids. The man from the mirror. "No," Ella muttered, shaking her head. She scrambled backward, bumping into the tool cabinet. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The chest responded with a groaning sound, the lid quivering as though it were alive. The air around her turned frigid, biting at her exposed skin. She felt something brush against her cheek, a whisper of a touch, too cold to be human. "Ella," the voice rasped again, closer this time. And then it stopped. The chest slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force of it shaking the floorboards beneath her. The oppressive cold lifted, but the air remained heavy, charged with something unseen. Ella's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her paralysis. She fumbled to retrieve it, the screen glowing in the dim light of the basement. Another text from the unknown number. "You should have left." Her breath hitched. The cryptic warnings had been unnerving before, but now they felt like an accusation. Whoever, or whatever, was sending these messages knew what she had done. And they weren't happy about it. Clutching the phone, Ella climbed to her feet, her legs shaking. She needed to leave the basement, to put as much distance as possible between herself and that chest. But as she turned toward the stairs, she froze. He was there. The man from the mirror. The man from the photograph. He stood at the base of the stairs, his form flickering like a faulty projection. His smile was the same, too wide, too cruel. Ella's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The man tilted his head, just as he had in the attic. He raised one hand, pointing at her, and spoke for the first time. His voice was low and smooth, with an undercurrent of malice that made her skin crawl. "Leave the house," he said. "While you still can." Ella's stomach twisted. "What? You want me to leave?" The man's smile faltered for a moment, his expression shifting to something almost mournful. But before Ella could say another word, his form began to dissolve, fading into the shadows that danced along the walls. She blinked, and he was gone. Back upstairs, Ella locked every door and window she could find, though she knew it was a futile gesture. Whatever haunted this house didn't need a key to get in. She sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she set the diary and her phone on the coffee table in front of her. Her mind raced. The chest, the man, the voice, it all pointed to one thing: the house wanted her gone. But why? And why the warnings? If the house was truly malevolent, why hadn't it just taken her, as it had with Lillian and the others? Her phone buzzed again. She grabbed it, dread coiling in her stomach. This time, the message was different. "He's lying." Ella stared at the screen, her blood running cold. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she typed a reply. "Who are you? What do you mean?" There was no immediate response. Frustration and fear churned inside her, but before she could type another message, the phone buzzed again. "The man. He's not trying to save you. He's trying to save himself?" Ella's head spun. What did that mean? Was the man in the mirror not part of the house's curse, but a victim of it? Or was this another trick, another layer of deception designed to keep her trapped? She didn't have time to dwell on the question. A sudden, loud bang reverberated through the house, making her jump. It came from upstairs. The attic. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going back up there." But as the banging continued, louder and more insistent, Ella felt a pull, an inexplicable need to investigate. It was the same compulsion that had drawn her to the chest in the basement, to the mirror in the living room. The house wasn't just alive, It was in control. Gripping the kitchen knife once more, she forced herself to climb the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the attic door, the banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her heart hammering in her chest. "Don't do it," she muttered to herself. But she turned the knob anyway. The attic was as she had left it, dusty, dimly lit, and silent. But this time, the air felt heavier, charged with a suffocating tension. Ella stepped inside, her flashlight beam darting across the room. And then she saw it. The mirror. It stood in the center of the attic now, its frame gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. She approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to run. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the glass began to ripple. Ella staggered backward as the man's face appeared in the mirror, replacing her own. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was twisted with fear and desperation. "Help me," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, don't trust the house." Before Ella could respond, the glass shattered. The sound was deafening, and shards of glass rained down around her. When she looked up again, the mirror was empty, just a jagged, broken frame. And in the silence that followed, the house whispered one final warning. "Choose carefully, Ella. Not everyone deserves to be saved." The house fell silent after the whisper, but the weight of its words lingered in the air, suffocating Ella. Not everyone deserves to be saved. She couldn't tell if it was a threat or a grim piece of advice. Either way, it left her shaken. Ella stared at the shattered remains of the mirror, the jagged edges glinting in the dim light. Her reflection no longer stared back. Just a distorted version of the attic, fractured and incomplete. The man's face was gone, but his plea echoed in her mind. "Please, don't trust the house." Ella's grip on the knife tightened. Her instincts screamed to leave, to walk out of the front door and never look back. But something rooted her to the spot. The house wasn't going to let her leave. Not yet. It had woven her into its story, and she wouldn't find peace until she unraveled it. The next morning, Ella made her way back to the Black Harbor Public Library. The sunlight offered little comfort, casting long shadows over the cobblestones as she hurried through the streets. The events of the previous night had left her with more questions than answers, and the cryptic messages on her phone offered no clarity. The librarian, Ms. Croft, glanced up as Ella entered, her brow furrowing in concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. Ella gave a weak laugh, the irony of the statement not lost on her. "I need more information about the Sanderson house," she said, keeping her voice low. Ms. Croft's expression darkened. "Did something happen?" I think the house is haunted," Ella admitted. "And I don't just mean whispers or flickering lights. There's something inside it, something alive." The librarian studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the back room. When she returned, she was carrying a thick, leather-bound journal that looked older than anything Ella had seen before. The spine was cracked, and the cover was embossed with an intricate design of vines and symbols. "This belonged to George Sanderson, the house's original owner," Ms. Croft explained. "He was an occultist, a man obsessed with life beyond death." Ella's stomach twisted. "An occultist?" Ms. Croft nodded. "He believed that the house could act as a vessel, a bridge between the living and the dead. According to local legend, he performed a ritual there, something designed to bind the souls of the dead to the house." "And did it work?" The librarian's lips thinned. "I'd say so. After his death, strange things started happening. People who lived in the house claimed to see George's spirit, or worse, claimed to hear him speaking to them, urging them to complete his work. Every family that moved in after that either disappeared or met a tragic end. The house has a way of holding on to people." Ella opened the journal, her hands trembling. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, and the pages were filled with diagrams, spells, and cryptic notes. One entry in particular caught her eye. "The binding ritual is incomplete. The house requires a host, a living soul to anchor the connection. Once the host is chosen, the cycle will be complete, and the house will transcend its mortal bounds. Ella's blood ran cold. A host. Was that what the house wanted from her? Was she the next piece of its puzzle? Why hasn't anyone destroyed the house? Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Croft sighed. People have tried. Fires, demolitions, exorcisms. None of it worked. It's as though the house rebuilds itself. Some believe it's cursed. Others think it's George, still clinging to his creation. Ella closed the journal, her mind racing. If the house needed a host, then maybe that was why it hadn't killed her yet. It was waiting for her to give in, to lose herself to its will. But the man in the mirror, he had warned her. Pleaded for her help. He wasn't part of the house, he was trapped by it. Just like Lillian had been. Ella stood abruptly, her resolve hardening. Thank you, Miss Croft. I think I know what I need to do. That evening, Ella returned to the house with the journal tucked under her arm. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the cliffs. The wind howled as she approached the front door, but she didn't hesitate. She wasn't afraid of the house anymore. The house was afraid of her. Inside, the air felt heavier than ever, as though the house itself knew she was coming for it. She made her way to the living room, placing the journal on the coffee table. All right, she said aloud, her voice steady. Let's finish this. The diary had mentioned a ritual, something hidden in the basement. Ella suspected the chest she'd found was the key, but she needed more information before she opened it again. She flipped through George's journal, searching for any mention of the chest or its purpose. Finally, she found it. The reliquary contains the soul of the first host. To break the cycle, the reliquary must be destroyed, and the host must be freed. But beware, the house will resist. It will do everything in its power to protect what is bound to it. Ella's chest tightened. The chest wasn't just a container, it was a prison. If she destroyed it, she could free the trapped souls, but it wouldn't be easy. The lights flickered overhead, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The house was reacting to her discovery, trying to scare her into submission. I'm not afraid of you, Ella said, though her voice shook. A low rumble echoed through the house, like a growl. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting and writhing as though alive. And then the whisper returned, louder than ever. Leave. Now. Ella ignored it, clutching the journal like a shield. She wasn't leaving until she finished what George had started. She made her way to the basement, her resolve firm. The chest waited for her, the markings on its surface glowing faintly in the darkness. The house roared in protest, but Ella didn't hesitate. She knelt beside the chest, gripping the key tightly in her hand. And as she turned it in the lock, the house's fury reached a crescendo. The chest lid creaked open slowly, as though it were alive and reluctant to reveal its contents. A wave of icy air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far older. Ella leaned back instinctively, shielding her face from the cold, but her eyes never left the dark interior of the chest. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be an old, blood-stained cloth. The fabric was tattered, the stains long dried into a sickly rust-brown color. Ella's hands trembled as she reached for it, the house rumbling around her in protest. The moment her fingers touched the cloth, a jolt shot up her arm, like static electricity magnified tenfold. She gasped, pulling back, but the cloth seemed to cling to her, unwilling to let go. The whispering began again, louder this time, overlapping voices that filled the room and made her head spin. Don't. Stop. Free us. Run. The voices clashed, rising to a fever pitch. Ella gritted her teeth, shaking her head to clear it, and forced herself to unwrap the bundle. Inside was an object she couldn't immediately identify, a blackened, twisted mass that looked like a cross between a shard of bone and molten metal. As soon as it was fully exposed, the house fell deathly silent. The air grew so heavy that Ella felt as though she were suffocating, the weight pressing down on her chest like an invisible hand. She stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the chest for support. And then the shadows moved. Ella froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The shadows along the walls seemed to detach themselves, pooling together in the center of the basement like liquid darkness. Slowly, they coalesced into a humanoid form, tall and imposing, with glowing red eyes that bored into her soul. The figure didn't speak, but its presence radiated malice. Ella felt an overwhelming urge to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She held the twisted object in front of her like a talisman, her voice trembling as she said, "What are you? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its red eyes narrowing. When it finally spoke, its voice was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to echo inside her mind rather than in the room. "You have what is mine." Ella shook her head. This thing in the chest? What is it?" The figure stepped closer, and Ella's knees threatened to buckle under its oppressive aura. "A fragment, a piece of what binds this place. Return it to the house, or suffer the consequences." Ella's grip on the object tightened. "No. I'm not giving it back. You're the one trapping people here, aren't you? George Sanderson's ritual, this fragment, it's part of what he used to bind souls to the house. If I destroy it, I can end this." The figure's form flickered, its edges fraying like smoke caught in a draft. For a moment, Ella thought it might disappear, but then it surged forward, its glowing eyes blazing with fury. "You don't understand." The voice was sharp now, layered with desperation. "Destroying it will break the cycle, but it will also release what lies beyond. Do you think you can control what comes next?" Ella faltered. She hadn't considered the possibility that breaking the binding might unleash something worse. The figure took another step toward her, its form towering over her now. "You cannot save them," it said. "You can only doom yourself." A sharp, clear voice cut through the oppressive silence. "Don't listen to it." Ella whipped around to see the man from the mirror standing at the base of the stairs. He was more solid now, his form no longer flickering, though his eyes were wide with urgency. "You have to destroy it," he said. "It's the only way to free them." The shadowy figure hissed, the sound like metal scraping against stone. It turned its attention to the man, its form rippling with fury. "You!" The man stepped forward, placing himself between Ella and the shadow. "I've been trapped here long enough to know what you really are," he said. "You're not protecting anyone. You're feeding off them, off their fear, their despair. She's going to end it." Ella's heart raced as the two entities faced off. She looked down at the fragment in her hands, its surface pulsing faintly, as though it were alive. The man turned to her, his expression softening. "You can do this," he said. "You have to. But you need to hurry. The longer you wait, the stronger it gets." Ella nodded, though her hands shook violently. "How do I destroy it?" The man pointed to the furnace in the corner of the basement, a rusted relic that hadn't been used in decades. "Fire. It's the only way." The shadow figure roared, the sound reverberating through the basement and shaking the walls. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the room into strobe-like chaos. Ella bolted for the furnace, clutching the fragment tightly, her mind racing. The shadow surged after her, its form twisting and stretching unnaturally as it tried to block her path. The man intercepted it, grappling with the darkness, though it was clear he was no match for its strength. "Go," he shouted, his voice strained. Ella reached the furnace and yanked open the heavy door. The inside was blackened with soot, but a faint warmth radiated from it, as though it had been waiting for her. She hesitated for only a moment before hurling the fragment inside. The instant it touched the furnace's interior, the basement exploded with light. A deafening roar filled the air as the fragment ignited, flames leaping from the furnace and consuming the darkness. The shadow figure writhed and shrieked, its form unraveling like smoke in a hurricane. The man stumbled back, his body flickering again as the light engulfed the room. He turned to Ella, a faint smile on his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. And then he was gone. When the light finally dimmed, the basement was silent. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, replaced by an almost serene stillness. The chest lay in splinters, and the furnace door hung open, its interior glowing faintly with the last embers of the fire. Ella sank to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know if she had truly freed the house, or if she had just unleashed something worse, but for the first time since she'd arrived, the house felt empty. And for now, that was enough. The stillness in the house was unnerving. For the first time since Ella had moved in, there were no whispers, no flickering lights, no oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Ella sat on the cold basement floor, staring at the remnants of the chest. The twisted fragment was gone, consumed by the fire, and the shadowy figure had disappeared along with it. She wanted to believe it was over, that she had broken whatever curse had gripped the house for so many years. But the uneasy silence told her otherwise. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, half expecting another cryptic text. Instead, it was a voicemail notification. The call had come from an unknown number. Ella hesitated, her thumb hovering over the play button. Something about the timing felt wrong, too coincidental. Still, she pressed it. A man's voice crackled through the line, low and urgent. Ella, listen to me. You've only opened the first door. There's more, deeper, beneath the house. The fragment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Find the crimson key. It's the only way to finish this. The message ended abruptly, leaving Ella with more questions than answers. The crimson key? Another door? She rubbed her temples, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't even know who the caller was, much less how they knew about the house or what she had done. Her gaze drifted back to the splintered remains of the chest. Among the debris, something glinted faintly in the dim light. Ella crawled forward, brushing aside bits of wood and ash until her fingers closed around a small, ornate key. It was beautiful, carved from what looked like dark red crystal. The light caught its surface, making it seem almost alive, as though it were pulsing faintly with an inner glow. The crimson key, Ella murmured, her breath catching. The moment she held it, the house seemed to stir. The floorboards groaned softly, and the air grew colder, carrying with it the faint scent of iron. Ella's instincts screamed at her to drop the key, to throw it away and run. But she knew she couldn't. If the voicemail was right, this key was her next step. Ella spent the next hour scouring the house, searching for any sign of a locked door or hidden passage. She started with the basement, feeling along the walls for seams or panels that might conceal an entrance. Nothing. Frustrated, she moved upstairs, her flashlight sweeping across every corner of the house. The key seemed to grow warmer in her pocket the closer she got to the living room. By the time she reached it, her hand was almost burning. She stopped in front of the mirror's shattered frame. Its jagged edges caught the light, reflecting fractured images of the room. Ella frowned, leaning closer. Something about the reflection didn't seem right. In the broken shards, she could see the living room, but there was a door there that didn't exist in reality. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but the longer she stared, the clearer it became. A narrow, arched doorway set into the far wall. Ella turned around, her pulse racing. The wall was blank, covered in faded wallpaper. But the mirror was insistent, showing her the door as if it were real. She reached out, running her fingers along the wall. At first, there was nothing. But then her hand caught on something, a seam she hadn't noticed before. With a sharp tug, the wallpaper tore away, revealing a wooden panel with a small keyhole carved into its surface. The crimson key pulsed in her hand as she withdrew it from her pocket. Her heart pounded as she slid it into the lock, the mechanism clicking smoothly. The panel swung open with a low creak, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Ella's stomach twisted, but she knew there was no turning back. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing as Ella descended deeper into the earth. Her flashlight flickered, its beam struggling against the thick, almost tangible darkness that surrounded her. The whispers grew louder with every step, overlapping voices that spoke in a language she couldn't understand. When she finally reached the bottom, she found herself standing in a cavernous chamber. The walls were rough stone, glistening faintly with moisture, and the air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood. At the center of the room stood a massive door, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she looked at them too long. The crimson key burned hot in her hand, pulling her toward the door as though it had a will of its own. Ella hesitated, her breathing shallow. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't something she wanted to face. But she had come too far to stop now. She stepped forward and slid the key into the lock. The symbols on the door flared to life, glowing with a deep red light that illuminated the chamber. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo as the door groaned open, revealing a darkness so complete it felt alive. Ella stared into the void, her heart hammering in her chest. And then, from within the darkness, a voice spoke. "You've come at last." The voice from the void was deep and resonant, carrying an ancient weight that sent a chill through Ella's bones. It echoed off the cavernous walls, each word sinking into the air like a physical presence. "Step forward, child," it said. "You have opened the way." Ella clutched her flashlight, its weak beam trembling as if the darkness were swallowing it whole. Her feet felt like lead, but some unseen force urged her forward, pulling her closer to the threshold of the massive door. "What are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. The voice rumbled, a low chuckle that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "I am what the house was built to contain. What George sought to control, but could not. And now, you stand where he fell." Ella's mind raced. The house, the ritual, the fragments, it had all been leading to this. Whatever George Sanderson had bound beneath the house, it wasn't just a collection of trapped souls. It was something far worse. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why have I been pulled into this?" The voice paused, as if considering her question. When it spoke again, its tone was almost amused. "You came here seeking answers, didn't you? A new start? The house chose you because it sensed your need, your pain. And because you are strong enough to decide." "Decide what?" The darkness inside the doorway shifted, coalescing into a figure, a tall, shadowy form with glowing red eyes. It was the same presence Ella had seen in the basement, but now it seemed more defined, more powerful. "To seal me away," it said, "or to set me free." Ella's pulse quickened. The air in the chamber grew heavier, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. The figure stepped closer, and with every step, the whispers that had plagued her grew louder, more insistent. She thought of the man in the mirror, his warning, his desperation. Had he been fighting to stop this? Or was he a pawn in the same twisted game? "I don't trust you," she said, her voice firmer now. The figure tilted its head, its red eyes narrowing. "And yet, here you are. Tell me, Ella, what do you trust? The man who begged you to destroy the fragment? The house that twisted his mind until he was no longer human? Or yourself, so desperate for meaning that you've walked willingly into the heart of darkness?" Ella clenched her fists, her mind spinning. The figure's words were sharp, calculated, designed to confuse her. She didn't know who to trust, but she knew she couldn't leave things as they were. "What happens if I set you free?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure smiled, a cruel curve of shadowed lips. "I will be what I was always meant to be. A force beyond life and death. The whispers will stop. The house will crumble. And you will be free to leave, unbound by its curse. And if I seal you away?" The figure's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been fear. "You will take George's place. The burden will be yours. The house will endure, and it will demand more from you than it ever did from him." Ella's throat tightened. She imagined herself trapped in the house forever, fighting to contain the darkness, unable to leave or escape. The thought was suffocating, but the alternative, letting this thing loose on the world, was unthinkable. "You're lying," she said. The figure laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder. "Am I? Or am I offering you the only way out?" The crimson key pulsed in her hand, its warmth growing unbearable. She looked down and saw that the symbols on the door had shifted, forming a circular pattern around a single indentation in the center, shaped perfectly to fit the key. This was it. The choice. Ella took a deep breath, her mind racing. The house had whispered to her, tried to break her. But it had also shown her the pain it had caused, the lives it had destroyed. If she set this thing free, she could leave. She could have her fresh start. But at what cost? I'm not like George, she said, stepping toward the door. The figure's eyes flared, and the air around her crackled with energy. No, you are not, it said. You are weaker. Ella ignored it, forcing herself to move. Her hand trembled as she raised the crimson key to the indentation. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the figure lunged toward her, its form distorting into a swirling mass of shadow. But it was too late. Ella slammed the key into the lock, and the door erupted with light. The figure howled, its voice raw and inhuman, as the light consumed it, dragging it back into the void. The chamber shook violently, cracks spreading across the stone walls as the house seemed to recoil. Ella stumbled back, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the house itself. When the light finally faded, the door was sealed once more, the symbols on its surface dim and lifeless. The crimson key lay on the floor, shattered into pieces. Ella sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. The house was still. The oppressive weight was gone. But so was her freedom. She looked up at the sealed door, her chest tightening as the realization sank in. She had stopped the darkness. She had saved the world. And now the house was hers.